Thank you, Barbara. Hi, everybody. I can't see you too well, but I have to admit to you all that I drove myself a little crazy over what I was going to say to you tonight. I walked around saying, what am I going to talk about? And then when I did get an idea, it was, how am I going to get this idea across? How am I going to say it? Well, the truth is, I was feeling a little blocked, kind of stuck creatively, and I was procrastinating. And the more I procrastinated, the more apprehension I would feel. And then I started to get some physical symptoms, like pain, like maybe a little laryngitis. And, Ernest Holmes says, all mind activity inevitably tends to create its physical correspondent. So I was definitely proving this science. Now, I think this often happens to us when we're not being true to ourselves in some way. I knew that something needed to bust through, something needed to change. Emerson called this experience divine discontent, that subtle unrest within that is prompting us to dig deeper, to discover something new. So during all of this going on, the last couple of weeks, couple Sunday afternoons ago, even though I was tired and in pain, I called a friend and asked if she wanted to go on a little hike. And now, I crave being in nature, and it had been a while. But part of me was saying, what are you doing? You should either be home in bed or you should be working on your talk. But the other part of me, the intuitive me, knew exactly what it was doing and what was needed. And it was guiding me perfectly. After the hike, my friend asked me a question, a simple question. But it led to a big realization for me. Something that I had not been acknowledging came tumbling out. And all things being perfect, my friend had her own wisdom to share with me about this realization, which helped me to understand it better. So something that I had not been acknowledging was suddenly illuminated for me. And I was clear what my next step was. Right then and there, I knew divine guidance was operating perfectly. I felt it, and I knew I was on the right track. And I knew that the feeling of being stuck was beginning to dissipate. So I became very clear that I needed to speak my truth with a loved one, a conversation that I had been avoiding without even really realizing it. So a couple days later, I spoke my truth, and after being in process a little, I also got very clear that each person needs to tell his or her truth, not just one, because we're always in relationship. One telling the truth and one acquiescing is not it. When both can acknowledge their truth and be heard, then there's the opportunity to witness Spirit's flow of love and watch how things seemingly miraculously turn around. Well, it takes a commitment on both parts to acknowledge what is, to hear what is, and hold on to the divine self, not allow someone's truth to cause a knee-jerk reaction, but to allow Spirit to weave itself through to a much more loving resolution than that ultimately brings growth and greater awareness, where there was once the appearance of blockage. Now, it's important to note here that the outcome I thought I would get after speaking my truth is not at all what I got. When we are truly being ourselves, we make space for Spirit to be the deciding factor. We get out of the way and allow that presence within us to know beyond what our human capacity to know is. And when we do this, the result is often something that pleasantly surprises us that maybe we hadn't thought of. Now, you might ask, why would you not acknowledge your truth? And I must tell you that usually I think I do, but for the most part anyway. But when there's a sensitive issue, something that might result in a big reaction or a prolonged period of discomfort, or that maybe speaking your truth feels like just a big risk and you have no idea what the outcome will be. Well, often I think that on some level we may just prefer to be in denial about our truth, thinking it's just easier not to deal with it. But as Canadian poet and writer Raymond Hull says, he who trims himself to suit everyone will soon whittle himself away. So let's not do that. Now, when I talk about your truth, I'm really talking about just being yourself, your authentic self. That's it. And the title of my talk this evening is Be Yourself. Now, last Sunday, a couple of Sundays ago, I was talking to Barbara up in Theater 3, and I found myself saying, I'm concerned that my talk is going to be too psychological. And she was listening to me, and I said, but that's who I am. And she said, well, what's your talk on? And I said, it's on being yourself. So, good, I'm glad you got that, because I thought that was hilarious. Now, one of the things I do in the world is work with children who have a diagnosis of autism. And I arrived at my client's house. He's a high-functioning 5-year-old. And I was at the door, and I could hear a lot of commotion inside, just a lot of noise and screaming. And, they have 3 boys, and the father's away a lot on business, and the mother is often frazzled. But it was a lot of yelling. So when the door opened, I walked in, and the mom was indeed yelling at Charlie's older brother. So I walked in, and Charlie came up to me and looked in my eyes, and without missing a beat, he said, that's what happens when we give her too many jobs. I need 3 moms and 4 daddies. And that was Charlie's truth. Simple, honest, poignant. He's just a natural at it. Now, to be clear, telling your truth, or being yourself, does not mean dumping or spewing negativity on somebody. Simple, responsible, honest acknowledgement of what is, communicated in a way that respects you and the other. That's what I'm talking about. Now, I've heard people criticize us religious scientists for not dealing with what is, not acknowledging the truth. Some of you may have heard people say, you're unreasonably positive. You have rose-colored glasses on. Or they might call us the ostrich religion because we bury our heads in the sand, they say. Well, these criticisms commonly come from those who don't have a strong foundation in this teaching, or perhaps from those who are committed to seeing things from just a narrow perspective. In Science of Mind, we do focus on what we want rather than what we don't want. And in our form of prayer, we do look past conditions to the spiritual truth, yes. But this doesn't mean that we ignore our inner voice, or that we deny what divine intuition is whispering in our ear, or that we pretend to feel what we think we should feel. It doesn't mean that we disregard the divine discontent within that is yearning to be recognized. No. This inner yearning is the I am presence within, the I am presence within. And answering its knock can only expand us. When we ignore the inner prompting, the divine discontent, which of course is God, we're not fully being ourselves. We're narrowing the container, which then limits our expression and experience of God. We're simply cutting ourselves off from all that we can be. Now, Shakti Gawain said, every time you don't follow your inner guidance, you feel a loss of energy, loss of power, a sense of spiritual deadness. I remember feeling this way when I was about 20. I had moved away to a new city for a college internship. And I had rented an apartment, and it was a tough internship. It was working with emotionally disturbed teenagers. And I allowed my boyfriend to move in with me, and I soon realized that was a big mistake, but thought I just had to live with it. I didn't realize at the time that it was okay to tell my truth, even if it was inconvenient. And I was trimming myself to suit the situation. And it was not until a brief visit from my father that I was able to turn this around. Now, my father is a man of maybe few words. He's quiet, he's introverted. And we happened to be standing in front of a mirror. We had a private moment. And we were looking into each other's eyes in the mirror. And all of a sudden he said, "Sharon, you look older." And in fact, my face definitely looked older. It was stressed. And he said, "Sharon," he said, "you don't need to stay here 1 minute longer if you don't want to. You can come home right now." And those words really got me. In that moment, I did come home within my own being. His words touched a deep truth in me that I had been afraid to fully acknowledge. And finally, I was able to begin being myself again, and then major positive changes followed right from that day. So, to be yourself then is vital to have a happy life. This is because God can only know itself through its creation. We are the vessels by which God experiences itself. And the unique selves that we are must be the means by which we fully allow and express Spirit. And no two of us are alike. So Spirit obviously wanted to know itself through the myriad of one-of-a-kinders that we are. Now, during the time I was putting this talk together, I was out on my morning walk, as usual, and I went down a street I often go down. But I noticed a car I had never noticed. And on the side of this car, it was a very colorful advertisement. And it said, "bu.org, because there's only one." Isn't that cool? It was like the universe winking at me. So in his book, This Thing Called You, Ernest Holmes tells us this. The divine pattern would be imperfect without you. Dare to be yourself. Stand in wonder before the majesty and might, the beauty and power of that divine presence which seeks expression through your individual life. Now, a wonderful example of someone who dares to be herself, I think, is Oprah Winfrey. And those who are in her inner circle say that they've never met anyone who is as sincere and real. They've never known anyone in the same way. And she says, "I know for sure that only by owning who and what you are can you step into the fullness of life." And she certainly has. Now, I believe we all ultimately want the fullness of life. That's why we're here. Now, from Emerson, Dr. Holmes learned that every man is a doorway through which the infinite passes into the finite, through which God becomes man, through which the universal becomes individual. So being yourself is a necessary prerequisite to having an open doorway for the infinite. Because if we are holding back who we are, if we're feeling blocked, stuck, or afraid to speak truth, to be ourselves, then our doorway is perhaps a little obstructed. We're limiting the divine flow. And I don't know about you, but I want my doorway to be free and open, and I want the biggest and best doormat that I can find. Welcome mat, I should say. Welcome mat in my doorway. Speaking your truth makes you an open channel for the divine, because there's no worry about what will they think, what if he can't handle it, what if blah, blah, blah. All the limiting thoughts. There's no mental knots. There's simply being free to be who you are in all your glory. And each time you stand in your truth and be who you are, you widen the container. Your channel is less cluttered. You make room to be used more fully by the divine to reveal itself through and as you. Ernest Holmes says, I think we can say without hesitation that the person who finds himself in God will discover at the center of his own being something which dominates without effort, something which does not have to assume a false front, something which by the very nature of its being is both human and divine. So the human act of speaking your truth, of being yourself, is the gateway and a necessary requirement to maintain an open doorway whereby the universal becomes the individual. So let's be dedicated to live our truth, to be ourselves, so that the supposed line between the universal and the individual dissolves. And we can live our lives with no distinction between the human and the divine. As the mystic Meister Eckhart said, between God and me, there is no between. And I am going to let Ralph Waldo Trine conclude my talk for me tonight with these words. Do you want to be a power in the world? Then be yourself. Namaste.